The divine is not approached by disappearing. Weakness seeks refuge. Strength seeks relationship. Iqbal reminds us, nearness to the divine begins when the self becomes worthy of presence. For Iqbal, closeness to the divine is not erasure of the self, but refinement of it. Faith matures through strength, responsibility, and conscious action. The stronger the self becomes, the more capable it is of nearness. Today, we continue our journey through Asrar Khudi, Allama Iqbal's philosophy of the self. This is episode 48. Nearness to the divine is not disappearance. It is becoming. The self does not approach the divine by disappearing. It approaches by becoming worthy of presence. The self learns that nearness to the divine is not achieved through weakness. Weakness seeks refuge. Strength seeks relationship. The self understands that the divine is not threatened by a strong self. The divine calls the self to strength. The self realizes that surrender, in Iqbal's vision, is not erasure. It is alignment. Alignment between will and a higher purpose. The self sees that the divine does not ask the self to dissolve into silence. It asks the self to speak through action. The self learns that the divine is not found by fleeing the world. It is found by engaging it consciously. The self understands that prayer is not retreat. Prayer is orientation. Orientation that directs the self toward responsibility. The self realizes that the divine relationship is not passive devotion. It is active cooperation. Cooperation demands strength. The self sees that fear creates distance. Courage creates nearness. Nearness grows where the self dares to stand. The self learns that humility does not mean inferiority. Inferiority weakens presence. Humility strengthens clarity without shrinking identity. The self understands that the divine does not demand submission. Born of fear. Fear distorts devotion. The divine calls for devotion. Born of love and awareness. The self realizes that closeness to the divine intensifies responsibility. Responsibility accepted deepens dignity. The self sees that the divine does not erase individuality. It refines it. Refinement strengthens selfhood. The self learns that the divine relationship is not mystical escape. It is ethical engagement. Ethical engagement gives form to faith. The self understands that strength pleases the divine more than helplessness. Helplessness denies potential. Strength honors it. The self realizes that the divine is not distant. Distance is created by indifference. Attention restores nearness. The self sees that devotion without action remains incomplete. Action gives devotion weight. The self learns that the divine is encountered in resistance. Resistance faced consciously reveals guidance. The self understands that obedience is not blindness. Blind obedience weakens judgment. Conscious alignment strengthens it. The self realizes that the divine does not replace the self's will. It elevates it. Elevation requires readiness. The self sees that reverence does not negate confidence. Confidence grounded in reverence becomes dignity. The self learns that the divine calls the self to maturity. Maturity accepts consequence without complaint. The self understands that closeness to the divine does not remove struggle. It gives struggle meaning. The self realizes that the divine relationship is not comfort. It is responsibility accepted in awareness. And the self begins to understand the divine is not approached by shrinking the self, but by refining it until it can stand. Without fear, the self begins to understand that the divine does not compete with individuality. It perfects it. Individuality refined becomes capable of relationship. Without fear, the self realizes that closeness to the divine is not emotional intoxication. It is clarity. Clarity that demands integrity. The self understands that devotion without awareness degenerates into habit. Habit dulls perception. Awareness restores meaning. The self sees that the divine relationship is sustained through action. Action aligned with truth becomes prayer lived. The self learns that reverence deepens courage. Courage without reverence becomes arrogance. Reverence without courage becomes fear. Balance preserves dignity. The self understands that the divine does not ask for surrender of intelligence. Intelligence refined becomes wisdom. The self realizes that closeness to the divine expands moral responsibility. Responsibility expanded strengthens character. The self sees that the divine relationship is not emotional dependence. Dependence weakens autonomy. Autonomy grounded in devotion creates strength. The self learns that faith matures through struggle. Faith untested remains idea. Faith tested becomes conviction. The self understands that the divine does not remove doubt. It teaches how to act despite it. The self realizes That obedience guided by fear shrinks the self. Obedience guided by love strengthens it. The self sees that the divine relationship demands honesty. Dishonesty fractures devotion. Honesty stabilizes it. The self learns that closeness to the divine does not remove responsibility. It intensifies it. What is entrusted must be carried consciously. The self understands that reverence expressed through action outweighs reverence expressed through words. Words fade. Actions remain. The self realizes that the divine relationship is not escape from consequence. It is courage to face consequence. Without evasion, the self sees that faith does not weaken resolve. Resolve strengthened by faith endures pressure. The self learns that closeness to the divine clarifies values. Values clarified guide decision. The self understands that the divine does not replace effort. Effort aligned becomes sacred labor. The self realizes that worship is not withdrawal. Withdrawal avoids life. Engagement sanctifies it. The self sees that the divine relationship does not remove individuality. It protects it from dissolution. The self learns that faith without discipline collapses. Discipline gives faith structure. The self understands that nearness to the divine does not mean immunity from error. Error acknowledged becomes correction. The self realizes that humility before the divine is not self-negation. It is accurate self-knowledge. The self sees that the divine relationship invites courage to live truthfully. Truth lived deepens presence. The self learns that closeness to the divine requires vigilance. Neglect weakens awareness. Awareness sustained preserves alignment. The self understands that the divine relationship is not inherited. It is cultivated. Cultivation demands effort. The self realizes that devotion matures. As the self matures, maturity aligns will with purpose, and the self begins to feel. The divine does not ask the self to disappear. It asks the self to become worthy of nearness. There comes a moment when the self understands that the divine is not approached through abandonment of strength. Strength refined is devotion in action. The self realizes that the divine relationship is one of trust. Trust built through integrity. Integrity expressed through consistency. The self understands that nearness to the divine demands courage. Courage to live truthfully. Courage to accept responsibility. The self sees that the divine does not demand constant reassurance. Reassurance weakens faith. Faith strengthened acts without guarantee. The self learns that closeness to the divine does not dissolve struggle. It deepens endurance. Endurance becomes worship. The self understands that the divine relationship is not silence alone. It is dialogue. Dialogue lived through choice and consequence. The self realizes that devotion is proven in difficulty. Ease reveals comfort. Difficulty reveals conviction. The self sees that the divine relationship refines will refined, acts with clarity. Clarity preserves dignity. The self learns that reverence does not demand fear. Fear distorts love. Love clarifies obedience. The self understands that the divine does not erase individuality. Individuality matured becomes capable of communion. The self realizes that nearness to the divine elevates purpose. Purpose elevated guides life. The self sees that faith does not remove uncertainty. It gives courage to act within it. The self learns that closeness to the divine demands ethical consistency. Consistency aligns belief with behavior. The self understands that the divine relationship is sustained through awareness. Awareness maintained prevents drift. The self realizes that devotion expressed only in words remains incomplete. Action completes faith. The self sees that the divine does not desire submission, born of weakness. It calls for alignment, born of strength. The self learns that nearness to the divine is not escape from selfhood. It is the fulfillment of it. The self understands that worship is lived responsibility. Responsibility embraced becomes sacred. The self realizes that the divine relationship anchors the self in meaning. Meaning anchored endures time. The self sees that faith deepens courage. Courage sustained strengthens presence. The self learns that closeness to the divine does not remove individuality. It protects it from disintegration. The self understands that devotion matures into trust. Trust liberates effort from anxiety. The self realizes that nearness to the divine is not distance from the world. It is deeper engagement with it. The self sees that faith becomes real when it informs choice. Choice aligned becomes character. The self understands that the divine relationship is not mystical escape. It is conscious participation in reality's unfolding. And finally, the self understands. The divine does not ask the self to vanish. It asks the self to rise.